This morning, you and I are chatting with my friend, teacher, mentor, Pam Houston. So recently, we were talking about short stories and how much I wanted to learn from you specifically about short stories, and we landed on an idea for a series. I think not very many people understand, and certainly I don't. What are the bones that make a great short story? Why do you love short stories? Why do they matter in the arc of literature?
To me, I guess short stories are like a distillation of everything that can be good about prose writing or everything that can be good about a novel. I think we all have a lot of novels that have changed our lives, that are very profound, that we've gone on this 300 or 500 page journey with an author, and our lives have been improved or opened or changed because of it. Well, it's like imagine being able to do that in 16 pages. It just feels to me like a short story has many of the attributes that make us fall in love with a novel. It has a character that we connect to, or more than one. It has a situation that we relate to, or that reminds us of times in our own life when we've been facing such a thing. It has setting, it has landscape, it has dialogue, it has all the components of good fiction writing. But every single word has to count, and it has to count like 10 times as much as every word in a novel, or more. To me, when there's a short story that takes your breath away, where you don't forget that character even though you've only spent maybe 35 minutes with them or 15 pages with them, or that compression of the essence of what it means to be a human that is on display in a million different situations across short stories, is just a profound act of art making. Whereas in a novel, there's all kinds of good things you could say about a novel, but you have a lot of time and space to make a thing happen. And in a short story, you're not wasting anybody's time. And I am a writer and a writing teacher who believes that compression almost always makes everything better. Um, I think there's not a piece of writing in the world that if you didn't sit down and take 10% out of it, it wouldn't improve it. And it's just about making language work harder. It's about respecting the reader's time and saying, like, I'm going to make every word count, so I'm not wasting your time. I want to deliver you this life, this powerful moment that's going to open your heart and take your breath away. And I'm going to do it so fast, you'll hardly know what hit you. And so that to me is like, it's just the most beautiful thing imaginable. I mean, poems can do that for sure. I'm not a poet, I'm a great admirer of poetry for a lot of the same reasons. But poems don't have the pressure necessarily of telling a story, and telling a story by boiling it down to its essence, its absolute critical metaphors, critical moments, critical character attributes, all of those things. It's like making a diamond, it's like the earth making a diamond. Every millisecond of it has to be powerful.
I've encountered you as a teacher who has taught novels and memoir and also generative writing situations. Why was this so interesting for you to do short stories?
Well, the short story is the form I first fell in love with. And I mean that way before I was any kind of a writer. I used to anticipate with great excitement the publication of the best American short stories every year when I was a teenager and a college student and all of that. The first books that were the most meaningful to me when I was started to study literature in earnest were collections of short stories. Two books that made me want to be a writer. If you were to say, what two books most made you want to be a writer? I mean, I could think about that for a long time and give a lot of different answers, but it would be Richard Ford's Rock Springs and Lori Moore's Anagrams, which are both collections of short stories. And I was studying the short story in graduate school. The book that gave me my whole career, Cowboys Are My Weakness, is a book of short stories. Like, to me, there is so much beauty in the form of the short story, and it's so underappreciated. And it's weird to me that it's still underappreciated because nobody has any time, and I always thought that, the short story would really catch on in a giant way because people are moving too fast in the same way that TikTok caught on in a giant way, but it just
Right.
hasn't ever happened. I mean, I just see people's face light up when you connect with someone who's really into short stories as a reader. But it's also a great way to write your first book. It's hard to embark on a book length project when you don't really know what you're doing. I mean, it's hard to embark on a book length project anytime, even if you've done 4 book length projects previously. But it's especially hard if you don't, basically understand not just the rules or even the craft elements of narrative, but just like time, time and narrative is one of the big mysteries for writers. And it's the kind of thing that you can't, like, it's not like you learn it and then you know it. It's kind of like faith. Like, you just have to ride alongside time. You have to have time as a writing partner when you're when you're writing, and it's gonna try to mess you up, and you have to make peace with it over and over again. Like, time is the biggest challenge in any piece of writing, how you manage it and how much respect you have for it and how it appears on the page, whether it's cyclical or chronological or circular. Or I tried to write a novel that denied time. Contents may have shifted, that denied its existence. I mean, time is a big complicating factor of making a piece of writing work. And in a short story, often you can learn. Trying to write short stories first is a good way to learn how to manage time or how to ride with it or how to learn when to surrender to it or when to fight it. These are all things that happen inside of a manuscript. And if you're managing, 30 years in a novel, not that that's, you can have a novel that only takes 5 hours, but if you're imagining a big amount of pages and a big amount of time, it's much, much harder than a short story that takes place in a weekend. And then time becomes sort of manageable. And there's a certain amount of pages, and you have a more finite feeling amount of decisions and how to manage time on the page. That I'm just using time as one example, but you could apply that to lots of different things in a short story. You're going to have a more limited number of characters. You're going to have a more limited number of scenes. You're probably going to have a more limited number of metaphors to juggle and to figure out which ones you're going to return to or which ones you're going to just use once and let go. All of those things, when you're learning to write, I think, you know, I think it's harder to write a great short story than it is to write a novel for the reasons I said before about a diamond. But I think when you're learning to write, short stories are great places to try out certain things and find out what kind of writer you are, because it's not a 3-year commitment. It's a 1-month commitment.
You know, Pam, I have to say, it's no wonder people love taking your courses because you just open the door and the floods come out. I have already learned 20 things I didn't know when I woke up this morning, and I'm captivated. Clearly, your passion also is part of what makes learning alive. One of the things that I'm fascinated about how you talked about this was that it wasn't just for people wanting to write stories, but you're also curating and talking to people who are great readers. And I want to hear about how that came to you and why you structured the class that way.
Well, that's the thing, if there's one thing that I would say people who want to be writers don't do enough is read. Like, and some people who want to be writers are great readers, but there's a whole lot of people who have somehow missed the idea that in order to embark on becoming a writer, you have to read a lot, a lot. And in this case, with the short story, I mean, another reason I was excited about this is that, again, generalizing here, but people who love the short story, they really love reading and they really love language. You
Mm,
know, like
mm,
some people read novels for the story, to enter a
mm.
world, no shame in this, to enter a world, to be with characters, to travel with them on a journey, to feel like, all the wonderful, warm, fuzzy things we feel when we dedicate ourselves to a novel, to reading a novel. But people who read short stories and the things short stories are doing, these are readers who by and large love language, love the mechanics of the form. This short story class is going to fall into this category of classes that I teach various places, which is basically reading like a writer, reading like a writer. But what I mean by that is we're going to look at these stories, not just and talk about, the things you would talk about in a literature class, like how they reflected the time or how they were part of feminism or how they were part of the environmental movement or whether, the characters exemplified blah, 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 like that's lit stuff. But we're going to talk about like, now, why did he open the
Mm.
middle of this scene? Now, when he was building this character, what are the first three things you can tell me about this character to see which of the particularities that he chose to use stuck with you, defined the character for you? Certain writers are so great about making a character in like three dependent clauses. Like they tell you three tiny things about them, and you're like, oh, yeah, I know them. Or did you feel like this story completed itself? Did you feel like it overdetermined its ending too soon? Did you feel like when did you become aware that the narrator was unreliable? Those are the sorts of things we're going to talk about, like about the strategies that the writer was using to get the effect that they got on the page. So it really is going to be like reading like a writer. We're going to dissect these stories. We're going to appreciate them first, and then we're going to dissect them for like what worked and how they made that happen. One easy example to describe would be like a first sentence that begins, on the day that Myrna left her husband and children forever, the first thing she did was make blueberry muffins. So like that's a strategy, right? You know the end now. You just sat down and you know the end. You know that Myrna's going to leave her husband and her children forever. So that's a strategy. Whereas if the first sentence is, Myrna got up, got out all the ingredients for blueberry muffins, then you don't know. That's an entirely different story. It's an entirely different story. Whether you tell the reader what's gonna happen,
Mm.
and then we're waiting for that car crash. That's one kind of anticipation or tension or suspense. Or if you don't tell them and then it comes as a surprise. Those are two completely different strategies. Change the world of the story entirely, even if the same exact things happen in the story. That's the kind of stuff we're going to talk about.
Yay. So exciting. So the format of the course is to spend a year with you. You were really excited when you started going through the possibilities of these stories that you were going to share. And it was a fantastic moment because your face lit up and you just started rolling. Tell me about that.
Sure. Well, we were talking about the course, and I had originally thought that it would be one short story per month, that would be the purest way to do it. And we'd really, really get into that short story. And then I started to make a list of short stories, first in my head, but then I was afraid I'd forget. So then on my computer, and I started to make a list of these stories, and all of a sudden there were 14, and then there were 16, and then there were 20. And I was like, okay, two stories a month, and if it hadn't been time to go to dinner or whatever, we would have been into 36 stories instead of, but I do really want them to be of course, I want them to be diverse and I want them to be various in their I want them to be diverse in all ways, and I want them to be diverse in their strategies. This is a teaching moment. So I want them to be really various, but I also want them to be, in my opinion, great, like life changing. I want them to be those diamonds, only those
Mm.
diamonds, the ones that there's a story. I'll just mention one off the top of my list because it's the I wrote down. And it's this story by Charles Baxter called Loyalty. I mean, it's a perfect story. Like, and I know we're supposed to be suspicious of perfection, but it has everything. It has the greatest character narrator, the most winning and complicated and nuanced voice. It's a beautiful situation. Um, a guy's ex-wife comes back to town after she has left him, many years after she's left him, and she's become unhoused, and he has to decide how to help her, basically. It's a story that's so much about generosity and kindness, and
Mm.
there's kids involved, her son, and then the stepchild. It's there's no way to talk about it that does it justice because every word is laid on the page with such perfection. And I don't know that a day goes by that I don't think of that story. I carry it the way you would carry a great encounter with a blue whale
Mm.
or something.
Wow.
It's a beautiful story about generosity on sort of the part of everyone in the story, in the family. But the last line in the first paragraph is let them arrive here, whatever they are, is my first motto. And my second is let them stay.
Mm.
And even to read that sentence, like just knowing the story as well as I do, it gives me goosebumps. It's a perfect story. And and I want to feel that way about every story. I will feel that way or almost that way. It is, to be fair, the first story I wrote down. But when I look at my list here, I am ecstatically in love with all of these stories, which is at this moment 24. We'll try to keep it to try not to go to 36. But it's really true. I don't get to talk about this very often. I don't get to share. I mean, I do teach collections of short stories in my writing classes, but only a certain amount because only a certain amount of the students are writing short stories. So this is just an opportunity for me to do something that thrills me, and makes me, fall in love with the whole pursuit of writing over and over again.
Oh, well, that's fantastic. And what I know will happen for the students is they get to bathe in that, right? Like when somebody truly loves what they do and what they're talking about, that it's like medicine.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
super excited. There's a twofold approach to this, and I'm being kind of mechanical in talking about this because I could just listen to your love of writers and books and language forever. But so the structure is a lot of us come together. We read these short stories every month. We come together and talk with you about them. We both share and learn about what you've laid in front of us. But there's another component that you can add on either immediately because you know you want to write short stories, or maybe toward a few months into it when you say, I'm really inspired and I now have some courage. And then you are offering the opportunity to workshop these in small groups. So if I wanted to write the best story of my life, the best short story of my life, I could submit my draft in 2 workshops. You want to talk about that?
Yeah, we were thinking about how to make this, both for readers and writers. And I think honestly, most people will be both, but not everyone. I really want to teach this short story class for people who just love to read short stories. But if you do want to write, I wanted, there to be a symbiotic relationship between the reading and the studying and the writing and the reading like a writer. So I thought what would be cool is that those people who want to write the best short story of their lives after all of this thinking and reading and talking about short stories, about halfway through the year, I'll offer a series of mini workshops. And what I mean by that, just so, because everything will be on Zoom, we won't spend hours and hours and hours on Zoom for the sake of everybody's aging necks. But I thought we would divide maybe into groups of six, and and everyone who wants to write a short story could send me a first draft of the short story or a draft of the short story. This will be, January or February, halfway through our year, depending on how many people want to do this. And you'll be with five others, and everyone will get the copies of those drafts. And then we'll come together on Zoom for a couple hours and we'll review them. And then we'll go back to the reading for 6 months. Toward the end of the year, you can turn in a more finished or polished draft of that same story, however much revised. That's up to you. You might think, oh, back to the drawing board and start over, or you might just have little bits of things to change, but we'll do it again toward the end of the year. And you should walk away with a finished, mostly polished draft of the best short story you ever wrote under the influence of these great, great short stories that we're going to be reading.
Well, I'm absolutely personally excited and sure grateful that this workshop is going to show up in this Pie for Breakfast Club. When I first encountered you as a writer, encountered you as a teacher, somebody sent me a short story that you'd written called The Best Girlfriend You Never Had. I didn't know. And of course, it's an amazing piece of work, and you can find it online. I think there's even video of you reading it, which I want to do. I haven't seen that or I haven't heard it. But what I didn't know after having read it, after having known you for a while, was that this particular short story was included in the best short stories of the century and selected by John Updike. Like, tell me about that. In the big wows of life's accomplishments, I mean, that's a big deal.
Yeah, no, it's a very big deal. And like for me, honestly, because of my true love of the short story and because of my dedication to that form, even though my own writing life has gone some other directions, I'm always kind of writing short stories. But because of how much I value the form, that's real. To me, being included in the best American short stories of the century, and honestly being selected by John Updike, who I believe is a great writer, uh, that's better than the Pulitzer for me personally. That's better than the National Book Award. That's better than a lot of other things that have not happened to me. I really mean that. Like there's only one century that I'm going to cross over like into. And 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 it was the last selection. It was 1999, which was sort of especially cool because the hardcover of that book came out without my story in 1999. And then they wanted to add the 1999 story for the paperback. So he was given, all of the stories that were published in the Best American Short Stories of 1999, which were some pretty darn good stories. And he picked mine anyway. And yeah, it was like the first time I had a story in Best American, the yearly model, was in 1992, and that was How to Talk to a Hunter. And I thought at that moment, nothing is ever going to happen to me professionally that is going to feel more validating than this, for all the reasons I already said. To be in that book that I waited for every year to come out. Like that book was my Bible when I was learning to be a writer, like all the way back to like junior high.
Wow.
Yeah. And so to appear in it was the ultimate for me. And then to appear in the century version of it, like it's really those sorts of achievements and accomplishments, I think are overrated. And it feels so much better to write a great short story than it does to win an award. It just does. And I say that all the time, and it's true. because that's between you and your work. And it's not dependent on fashion or anything else. It's inside of you. And that feeling when you've really nailed a scene, there's nothing better than that that's ever going to happen to a writer. But that said, of all the things that might have happened to me, being selected by John Updike for Best American Short Stories of the Century was the thrill of a lifetime.
And a lifetime that's taken you to 90 countries, and you've seen the globe. That's really quite something. Pam, I spent 2 years with you in the Writing by Writers draft program, and we were on Zoom once a month, and then we did in-person stuff. But I literally could show up and listen to you talk about your love, the structure that you understand about writing, the generosity that you bring, like forever. I could show up on Zoom and just listen to you talk, as I'm sure a whole lot of people are going to feel about today. You were really generous with your heart and soul around the topic of the short story. I will do all the follow-up stuff on where people can find it. And it's kicking off in September. Early bird registration's happening. Thank you so much for coming today. Thanks so much for showing up to this particular series, and we'll talk to you soon.
Sounds good. Thank you, TJ, for putting it together, because while I'm really good at this part, I'm not so good at the nuts and bolts. So I really appreciate you creating the room, the literal Zoom room, for us to have this conversation. And all that stuff matters too. Have to give people a way to find it and get there. So I really appreciate that. I appreciate the spirit you bring to it. And it was your idea in the first place. I was like so excited. That's like, I can't think of anything I'd rather do than talk about short stories for a year.
Thanks. I'll see you soon. Have a good week.
Great. It was great. Okay. Bye-bye.
Okay, bye-bye. What a great time with Pam Houston today. For those of you wanting to learn more about the series, head on over to pieforbreakfastclub.com, click on workshops, and the 2-part series will be explained in The Art of the Short Story, a masterclass with Pam Houston. You can register in 1 or 2 parts. When you click this button, select either course registration part 1 or course and writing 1 and 2. If you want to hear the full episode of the podcast with Pam, you'll find it here at the center of the home screen or under podcast at the Pie for Breakfast Club. Thanks so much. Hope you're finding great joy wherever you are today.